is in the EJ analysis process. And there's a number of references. A couple of them are in your materials. Reference C, methodologies for promoting environmental justice. And then there's another one from the Federal Highway Administration for environmental justice. Federal Highway, because they probably at the state and federal level have been the agencies that have done more to advance the approach for how you do the analysis than any other sector of public work. So as an example, as I indicated, Federal Highway, their guidance, avoid, minimize, or mitigate full and fair participation. So they got both those aspects. And then they go on to the economic. They've actually already integrated the economic aspect of this to prevent the denial of, reduction, or significant delay in receipt of benefits. Well, what do they mean by benefits? For Federal Highway, they've expanded that to economic and social to some extent. Again, we talked about some of these definitions. They're not precise. And I want to reemphasize this idea that as you're doing environmental justice, you have to be real clear right up front. How are you going to define your EJ communities? What are the criteria? Because there are no black and white criteria. Low income has been defined here as $12,760 per individual. You add $44.80 for each additional individual. That's the definition of a low income family. Doesn't relate to what is a low income community. Different definition. Low income communities by the White House. This is White House Environmental Justice Action Committee. They identify where you have 30% or more of the population with an annual household income equal to or less than 80% of the median income level at the national level. Some states use the same definition, but instead of saying at the national level, they use the state statistic as their measure. So again, you've just got to be aware of how your state may be defining your criteria a little different than how the feds define it. So if you're doing a joint program and you've got EJ issues, let's say you're working with the Corps or you're working with FERC, when you talk EJ, you got to make sure you're both using the same definitions, or at least understand where you're using different definitions. So what it means is you're within this band right here. So it's between either 200% of the poverty line or 80% of the median, somewhere in here, and you have to decide where. And it's 30% more of that census block you're looking at, that the families in that census block fall within this criteria. Now, that's not a universal definition, but for most federal agencies, that's what they're using to define an EJ census block. It does vary. That's for the income side. What do we mean by minority? It used to be defined as Blacks, Hispanics, Asian, American Indians, and Native American, Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders. That's been redefined by the White House out of CEQ. They've now separated Blacks from African Americans. I'm not sure exactly why, but when they do the statistics, they combine the two. They've added other non-white races or linguistically isolated. Anyway, this is the list of what they characterize, and we'll show you on your data analysis tools how that works. Readily identifiable group. Typically, that's a census block. It doesn't have to be a census block. I've done this at a city block level. So you have to decide based on your project, what is the level of identification you want to go to. So to show you how states do it a little differently, here's Pennsylvania. Census tract, 20% more of individuals live at or below the federal poverty level, and or 30% or more of the population identified as non-white. Well, if you remember the other criteria I just gave you, this 20% at the federal level is 30%. Pennsylvania uses a different criteria. Department of Agriculture, they use a different criteria. So it's not a universal regulation as to how you define this. even within the state of California, it's not defined precisely. Now, when you are working in this area, different states have different environmental justice laws and regulations. Notice the blue are those that don't have any. Proposed are the kind of the brown, and the enacted are those in this kind of an off yellow color. I don't think any of that surprises any of you in terms of where you might expect to have environmental justice at the state level. But it does give you an idea that not every state has been very aggressive in dealing with this. Your state in California is probably one of the most aggressive. You, New Jersey, New York are three states that have been very aggressive with how you deal with environmental justice. Not to discount Oregon and Washington. They're very aggressive as well. But so in New Jersey, they apply the EJ law to 8 types of facilities, meaning transportation facility, a manufacturing facility, urban development facility, whatever. They have 8 types, and we're not going to go into all that, but just to show you how every state, their new regulations took effect in April of this year. They had regulations previous, but they were updated as of April of this last year. This is how they define it. 40% of households have limited English proficiency, and they have a database, much like CalEnviroScreen that you all use in California, that characterizes for each census block, and they use census blocks for this. Here are the 8 areas. So scrap metal, landfills, sewer treatment, sludge disposal. So these are the areas that in New Jersey, they have very specific regulations that deal with all this. Oregon has a different one. Pennsylvania has a different one. Again, I'm only showing you this to show that different states have different definitions. Here's California. Census tract receiving the highest 25% of the overall score from CalEnviroScreen. Well, this is more complicated. Now you've got to go into your tool, which will show you how that's used, and it will calculate a score for you. I'm going to show you what it's composed of, but that's how you do it. And that talks about what the score has to be in, and census tract identified. And any lands under the control of federal recognized tribes are automatically considered EJ communities by your state statutes. So, and I'm not going to get into the technical. I'll give you the table that shows you. You can pull this up from CalEnviro, but you notice it has an average exposure to environmental effects, exposure to air pollution, exposure to water pollution, hazardous waste, lead, a number of measures that they have for pollution, what they call pollution burden. They score it. Then they look at the average sensitivity of the population and social and economic factors, and there's a multiplying factor. So you take the exposure level based on the population characteristics, and that gives you a CalEnviroScreen number. Now you can go look that up. Here's the list. You go to CalEnviro, we'll show you where that is, and it gives you your census tract, and then it gives you your various scores. I picked the table and prioritized it based on the highest EJ numbers. And so when you look at where these are, Fresno, San Joaquin, Los Angeles, another Fresno, it gives you the actual location, geographical location. Anyway, you can kind of see where some of these are. A lot of them are in LA. These are the highest ones. But if you want to know when you're doing a project, you can go into the database. You can find out what that census block number is, and you can go into the table and you can pull up the EJ screen rating. So before you can do anything about it, you got to first define it, okay? Which we've talked about, and that's not necessarily a thing to do. I pulled this quote just to kind of show you how this is not easy. Ultimately, meeting the needs of affected communities is contingent upon clearly consistent identifying the criteria for communities concerned. EJ community definitions difference across states and entities. Let's move into what is it you do? And as I go through this, I'm going to integrate this whole idea of the justice components. Remember, I talked about process justice, legitimacy justice, and fair treatment? Well, I'm going to integrate that. As you are doing the analysis process, how do you ensure that you are considering the aspects of those communities in your analysis? And we're going to start with problem framing, information gathering, options, analysis and valuation, decision making, and monitoring and adjustment. And we're going to walk you through these phases of analysis. These should look familiar for any of you that do CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, or NEPA. This is the same decision-making process you use in those analytical tools. Nothing new here. Those tools are based on decision science theory, so it's not surprising that you have an overlap. We're going to start with problem framing. Now, notice I've got involving the public as integrating in all of these phases. I show it as a linear process. It's not linear per se, meaning I may have an EJ issue that may cause me to go back and gather more information. My EJ issue may cause me to actually reframe my problem. And then in the end, I'm going to talk about adaptive management. That is the technique that you will find is gaining larger and larger favor within state and federal agencies' decision making, is to build an adaptive EJ approach. So the idea here, if you take a look at environmental justice and how you're tracking it, you can build it into the purpose and need. Why are you doing the project, and what are you proposing to do that's creating a problem? What are those EJ issues that are created by your proposal? That's typically in a what we call a purpose and need or introduction section to your environmental document. From your issues, you then generate alternatives to resolve those environmental justice issues. That's in what we call an alternative section. You then go to the technical effects analysis, which talks about how you evaluated those environmental justice issues and what mitigation measures you imposed and why. So we're going to start with problem framing. Are there EJ objectives, what I'm going to call purposes, that can be added to the purpose and need of your NEPA or to your CEQA analysis? Or as my wife always keeps telling me, to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, you must first remove your own. What we mean by that, don't get caught up with the objectives and mission of your agency as a driving force for solving the problem. With your state or federal agencies, you get blinders on, and you take a look at your problem from your very narrow agency perspective. You have to back away from that a little bit. Look at it from the perspective of others. So I'm going to give you an example. This is JFK Airport. Airplanes fly out of JFK Airport off this runway, flying out over the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge. If you remember years ago when Captain Sully had to land his airplane up in the Hudson River, which is about 10 miles north of here out of LaGuardia Airport. Why? The engine shut down because of a bird strike. Well, that's the issue here at JFK Airport. Airplanes fly out over this and they get up about 200 feet and they're flying right over this wildlife, Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge. It's primarily aimed for migratory birds. Well, I think you can appreciate you got conflicts here, right? Let's assume that your need, your problem is to ensure passenger safety for potential aircraft collisions with bird at JFK Airport. How do others perceive that problem? Well, if you look at that need statement, passenger safety, FAA would give the FAA the authority to take the lead on this project. And their whole focus is on maintaining passenger safety. How do others perceive this problem at JFK Airport? The refuge people, those people that created the refuge legislation back in the 1930s, those airplanes are killing off our birds. They're chasing them away. The whole reason we created that wildlife refuge was to preserve birds. And now you're telling us we got to manage these birds somehow, that they're a problem. No, the airport is the problem, not the birds. Well, that's Save the Gulls Association perspective. Airport Authority, their whole mission, scheduling aircraft in and out of JFK Airport. They're not so concerned about the birds other than it's affecting their scheduling. They got to delay flights. Well, they want to delay flights. They got airport property they got to protect. And that's all based on the airport authority that they have. Prevent noise over neighborhoods. There's a Sydney ordinance and an EJ issue here about noise over the neighborhoods. If you take a look at the environmental justice communities, these communities up here, so one solution, let's say a solution for the JFK airport or for the airport and the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge is we'll taxi our airplanes out to the end of the runway and we'll fly the aircraft out over the city. Well, those communities out here are mostly environmental justice communities. They don't want the noise of aircraft flying over their property all the time. So that's what constitutes neighborhood. That's an EJ issue. Now, in the end, the purpose and need of this project was to control nuisance wildlife. That didn't fall to FAA. It didn't fall to the Airport Authority. It fell to Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, Department of Agriculture. Now, the only reason I go over this example is to show you, depending on how you characterize your problem, will determine who the lead agency is going to be. There's a story I don't have time for as to how this happened at JFK Airport. It's a fascinating story of how NEPA experts at the federal level were able to manipulate the problem statement in a way that didn't fall to the FAA and it didn't fall to the Airport Authority and didn't fall to the Fish and Wildlife Service or Park Service. They specifically wrote the needs statement, the problem statement to fit APHIS's mission. When you do this, you are given discretion as an agency to define the purpose and need, the problem. It's not unlimited. This last statement I don't like. It's kind of a lot of legalese. Statutory objective of the project serves a guide by which to determine the reasonableness of objective. What the hell they mean by that? What they mean, let's say this is my purpose and need, ensure potential aircraft collisions to birds. I can also have an objective, must also be met to maintain bird populations. When I add that objective, you need to underpin that with regulation or law. Well, in this case, I go back to the refuge legislation, which stipulates that refuge must be managed to protect wildlife. Well, that means I can't be flying airplanes over the refuge during certain periods of the day because of the risk to wildlife. The Airport Authority, scheduling airports, that's required by the Airport Authority legislation. That authority specifically tells the airport they have to maintain scheduling in and out of JFK Airport. Well, that means I can't be messing around a lot with modifying my schedule of air traffic landings and takeoffs, even at protecting passenger safety. I've got to also protect my schedules and noise over the neighborhood. City ordinance limit the amount of noise at particular times of the day that can be expressed over those neighborhoods. Now, all of these become purposes that are added as requirements in satisfying my underlying need. Now, the reason I go over this, as you're developing a problem statement, it's easy for you to have an underlying problem, but you can come down and add an environmental justice objective that also must be met while satisfying and solving the underlying need. It's a very powerful tool to work with your EJ communities in showing them that you are serious about integrating their concerns as part of your problem statement. It goes a long way to increasing trust and credibility by building that into your problem statement. That's the first thing. Second, you got to identify data. So you got to go out and collect data on your EJ communities, where they are, which ones are truly environmental justice communities, which are not. Are they going to be affected more disproportionately than other communities? But then you're going to develop an EJ issue. Collect recent data, establish geographical bounds for analysis. Does your program, policy, or activity create an adverse effect in the short, medium, or long term that's borne predominantly by your minority communities? Understand, it's not saying you can't have effects to a minority community, but is that impact shared disproportionately by those communities? And then, of course, you solicit input from those communities as to what they believe are the issues and document it. So, where you're going with this is you're going to develop an issue, what we call an EJ issue. Just like this little cartoon, EJ issues are about perceptions, not necessarily reality from your agency's lens. Using this cartoon, let's say we got this lumberjack guy and he's out here and he makes chairs for a living. Well, he looks at this tree out in the middle of nowhere and he says, the very last chair. However, some environmentalist is looking at this and saying, no, 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 that's the very last tree. Perspectives. Just because you as an agency perceive it as the very last chair doesn't mean the EJ community doesn't perceive it as the very last tree. You need to be open to how they are perceiving the issues. When you write an issue without bias, show a conflict with what we call cause effect. I'm going to show you what I mean by that. And write as specific as possible. So you start with an action. Is the action located in proximity to an EJ community? Does that location increase an exposure level? Does that exposure level increase health and safety risks? And what is the ultimate impact of that increased exposure and risk? That's kind of the thought process that you walk through. I took this from DOT, just to kind of give you an idea. Inadequate public transportation is available in urban Atlanta. Proposed cuts in service and fare hikes will make it difficult for community residents to pursue employment or an adequate living standard. I don't disagree. That's an issue. Is it an EJ issue? What's the exposure to an environmental hazard? And what's the risk? There isn't one. I characterize this as an economic issue. It's not specific, but nevertheless, and what you're going to find is some communities will try to couch everything under the EJ umbrella. I don't discount this as an issue. It's a legitimate concern of that community, but it's an economic issue. It's not an environmental issue. Here's another one. Proposed bypass, Freeway I-435, by the way, this is in Tennessee, is proposed through Deer Park community of low-income population. Increase in noise. Notice in this one, increase in noise and toxic air quality constituents will result in long-term health risks, hospital visits, and potential deaths to these minority populations. That's an EJ issue. It's not specific. I would have written it much more specific with data and risk and all that, but they're getting at the right idea that you tie this to exposure, risk, and ultimate health and safety related issues. That's an environmental justice issue. Be careful you don't blend all this stuff where you're looking at environmental, social, and economic all blended together. They lose their focus when you do that. These are some of the burdens that you find. Disruption to community cohesion. That to me is a social issue. DOT puts this as an EJ issue. I don't characterize it that way. I characterize it as social. And the way I'm going to deal with it is different. Adverse employment effects. Again, I consider that not, I could make it an EJ like Doug suggested. Yeah, I can draw those connections, but that's in and of itself, I would not characterize that as EJ. Anyway, you can kind of see some of the typical issues that you get. Let me give you a real one to show you how this gets a little bit complicated. This is a megaload. This is up in Idaho, Montana. This was the megaload back in the about 2005 in that area. What they were doing is you can see they're taking these megaloads. What they're doing is this is all the equipment going up into Canada for the all the oil development. This road, by the way, going up is a 2-lane mountain road. When they take these megaloads, they take up both lanes. They have to shut down the road. The issue was they had to shut down the highway for long periods of time. If you look at the ownership pattern, a lot of tribal ownership up in this area. Well, the tribe, being aware of environmental justice, tried to couch all their issues in EJ terms. They tried to do it with looking at noise, and they tried to look at impacting sacred sites and access to sacred sites, and they did all kinds of inventive issues. Turned out this wasn't about EJ issues. This was about all of the Native American businesses along that highway, that recreationists going up and down this road for recreation purposes would stop at a lot of the tribal businesses and do business. That's an economic issue. Well, when they changed it over to an economic issue, things came together much better, particularly as it regards to mitigation measures. So what they ended up doing was they would haul these megaloads late at night. They wouldn't haul them on weekends. And so there were ways of mitigating that given the proper construct of what the issue was. So be a little careful when people start casting issues as environmental justice that you really understand what the issue is. All right. Now, once you've got your issues, then of course, then you start to develop alternatives, mitigation measures. A caution, you're going to find that there are long-term injustices that have existed to EJ communities. You know, these aren't all of a sudden new issues. They've been around for decades. And a problem you can run into is when you're doing a project, when you involve those communities, you're going to find often they will want you to solve long-term EJ problems at your project level. The scope of your project isn't going to be able to solve those long-term injustices. You have to elevate that to what we call a program level. Be real careful when you get an EJ community that wants you to solve a long-term existing inequity. They want you to mitigate it with your project, even though your project has nothing to do with solving or correcting their long-term injustice. You have to elevate that to a higher level of decision making, probably at what we call the program level. You got to be careful that you narrow the EJ concern or the EJ problem is driven by your project, that the EJ concern isn't a larger concern for which your project cannot resolve. But when you do that, you've got to at least indicate to that EJ community what is the appropriate process by which that program level problem can be addressed, even though it won't be addressed at your project level. So what I mean by that, I've got a project level issue and it creates some EJ. Maybe it has to do with water exposure to increased levels of contaminant in drinking water. And that the distribution system is such that the treatment center you're doing really is a treatment center that affects EJ communities more than it does others. And so the community is concerned about that particular pollution. Well, that EJ community may also have a broader issue with the pressure, the water pressure of delivery to our EJ community. You guys have never brought in the appropriate technology to increase the service pressure of our delivery system. That's a legitimate issue, but it may be a long-term issue that doesn't relate to your particular treatment issue at the project level. That may be a broader program level issue that you've got to elevate to a higher level and deal with it at a different level of analysis. And you're going to find that will happen to you a lot with EJ. They want you to solve the longer term problems with your site specific project. Now, when you develop alternatives, they've got to meet your purpose and need, got to comply with law, and they got to meet your regulation and policy. That kind of constrains all your alternatives. But the way you design it, theme driven, issue driven, mitigation driven. And here's what I mean by that. Theme driven. Remember I talked about JFK Airport? If my theme is an EJ theme over noise to the local community, what alternatives could I do that would maximize that theme of reducing noise? Because noise is one of my purposes. That's what we mean by objective driven. And so I come up with a set of alternatives that are driven by that one theme. Some of them may be legal, some may not. You can eliminate a lot of those. Issue driven. This is where I don't have a purpose for environmental justice. So let's say JFK Airport, that I don't have a purpose that deals with increased noise to the city. But the citizenry has complained for years about the amount of noise of takeoffs over the city. And by dealing with this bird issue, you're going to start flying more airplanes over the city when those birds are flocking so you can maintain your schedules as one of your purposes, but you don't have a noise purpose. That's an issue. Well, that's what we mean by issue driven. And then you develop kind of the same sorts of alternatives you might have under the theme. The difference is that it's not a purpose of your project. It just is an issue. When we say mitigation, that's where you combine a lot of simple mitigation measures together, and you have an alternative that is with all this mitigation, an alternative without all of that mitigation. It's kind of a with and without. There are no rules on how you develop alternatives. Pretty much up to you. Now, when you mitigate, here's kind of an order of priority. Avoid. If you can't avoid, minimize. If you can't minimize, rectify. If you can't rectify, reduce. And if you can't reduce, compensate. I have found that when we deal with EJ issues, it really doesn't follow this order of priority. It's almost reversed. Well, we'll compensate you for this impact. And if we can't compensate you, well, then we'll reduce it. If we can't reduce it, then we'll rectify it. And if we can't rectify it, we'll minimize it. God, the last thing we want to do is avoid it. Now, I'm being overcritical here, but you'll find that for a lot of EJ, the thought process is almost reversed. Ideally, though, in your thinking, think about, can I avoid it? If I can't avoid it, can I minimize it? If I can't minimize it, can I rectify it? And so forth. It's a nice logic sequence of how to think about mitigating environmental justice. Now, when you got this array of alternatives, you eliminate them. Lots of reasons to eliminate alternatives, and this is not a workshop to go through that process, but you can kind of see the list. That's up to you. The idea is to limit the number of alternatives down to a set that responds to your EJ community needs, but you don't want to have 10 or 15 alternatives. Human decision theory tells us we humans like at least 3 alternatives minimum. We don't deal very well with more than 5 or 6. So as you're doing your EJ options and looking at alternatives and all that, don't seriously look at more than 6 options. Then the important part is to evaluate effects. This is the crux of what makes you defensible in your EJ analysis. This is what we call the hard look or arbitrary capricious standard, is based on your ability to show the thought process that you used in comparing options and mitigation measures. So how does it work? You typically are going to look at the census tract level, but not always. I'll show you an example where we got much more refined than that. Here's how it's done. You start with an action. That action, does it have physical proximity exposure to an EJ community? Does that lead to health risks? And does that lead to social and economic implications? Now, notice I take my EJ endpoint, health risk, and I extend it into the social and economic. I don't stop here. That's where my EJ mitigation may actually reside. But in the analysis, I connect that whole resultant social and economic. And you got multiple feedback loops. I mean, I got these feedback loops that go back up to maybe new actions. Uh, Health risk may deal back up here to proximate exposure. There's all kinds of feedback loops in this. But as a general thought process of how you construct your thinking, this is the way to think through developing your environmental justice cause effect analysis. So I'm going to give you a real example. This is LA. This is a pipeline, an oil pipeline that is going from Santa Barbara, coming down just west of LA, right through Watts and down to Santa Barbara. This is the proposal to build this pipeline. It goes down an existing railroad right-of-way. So we already have a railroad right-of-way corridor that goes down through here. So I don't have to do condemnation of property or any of that. The issue, EJ, is going through Watts. Well, that's the action. But what's the EJ issue actually? Well, this is a map. Here's Watts. Here's my line. Those in red are my high scoring EJ census blocks. Well, you can see the whole power line, or this whole line goes right down through EJ communities. Surprise, surprise, right? I mean, that railroad corridor has existed there for a long time. And of course, people don't like living around railroad tracks. And so you end up with a lot of minority communities around railroad tracks, as well as just the development of how this whole, Compton, Linwood, and that whole community developed. Here's the airport, by the way, for those of you who fly out of the air. There are issues relative to that as well. I'll talk about that later. But that's the nature of this project. Here's the EJ statistics for one of these census blocks. There are 4 census blocks in here, but I just kind of used one of them. Here's the EnviroScreen percentile, 100, as high as you can go. Overall, notice population 6,000. That's very typical of a census block. Asthma, it's in the 95% level. Poverty, 96. This is very high EJ area. And yet you're going to build this new pipeline right down this railroad corridor. Well, what are the issues? One of the issues, removing soil from the right-of-way. Okay, so why do I care? You're going to remove the soil. What's that got to do with EJ? It's near the EJ community. Yeah, it goes right through it. All right, proximity. That's the proximity, right? What about the exposure? Toxic dust is going to get into the air. Toxic dust into the lungs, particularly of children. Hospital visits. Increased family expenses. Hospital visits is an EJ endpoint. Kind of follow that? But notice it also goes to increased family expenses. That's an economic transition. So I don't stop right here. I take that all the way to its economic implication. But that's my social and EJ endpoint, hospital visits, increased family expenses. Now, how far do I take this? Let me show you. Unhappy household leads to domestic violence, increase in police force. Now, notice I put these in different colors, and the reason I did that was this is the logic train that one might follow. But what is supported by data and information, science studies? Can I support going from increased family exposure to unhappy households? Can I go from that to domestic violence, or can I go to increased police force? Probably not. That's where the judgment call comes in with how far do you take this? So, where you take this then is a lot of judgment on your part as to you take it to its EJ endpoint, but that's where you may have to take it beyond that to its economic and other social kinds of endpoints. And that's okay. Just don't mischaracterize this endpoint as an EJ endpoint. That's an economic endpoint. You may resolve that very different than how you resolve mitigating hospital visits. You kind of follow that? Okay. It shifts the whole mitigation strategy different. So again, we're going to come back to this later. There's lots of data on developing, this whole idea of your census blocks and where they are and EJ communities. We'll talk about that next. EJ Screen and Cal Enviro Screen. We'll talk about those mapping tools this afternoon. But you can go to your census and American Community Survey data. It also provides raw data. Additional data, Highway Department has lots of data as well. These are available from me. I think this one's actually in your reference materials on additional data sources you can go to. In fact, I'll talk about this later. The problem with environmental justice, whenever I deal with agencies on environmental justice, they always tell me, they say, Ray, we don't have enough data. By the time I get done exploring to them the amount of data they have, they're overwhelmed with the amount of data that is available. It's almost too much data. Some of it's contradictory, but nevertheless, it's almost overwhelmed with data. So I don't spend a lot of time going over data sources. These are just some of the few that, as you get into this, you may want to explore. EJ Screen Guide. I'm going to go into detail on how you use EJ Screen. It was just updated in 2022. So, as example, I've got this issue now: increased hospital visits, right? Based on my EJ community, and I asked myself, how might I mitigate these hospital visits? Well, that's a different analysis tool. For those of you who do total quality management or what we call Ishikawa diagramming, fishbone diagramming is what it's called. What you do, you take an endpoint, increase hospital visits, and you back into the various components that may be responsible for increased hospital visits. In this case, I'm going to use exposure, practices, proximity, materials. Notice proximity and exposures are EJ components specifically. Practices and materials are ones that I've added, but there is no prescribed number of these categories. But in this case, what you do, you brainstorm. What might I do? Well, here's a whole list of potential mitigation measures. Move EJ residents, change project location, expand medical treatment, blow dust away. In the end, how this problem got solved with his EJ community, collected all the contaminated overburden, all the oil, contaminants, heavy metals that had been dropped by the railroad over decades on this corridor. They collected all that stuff. They watered the dust as they were doing the excavation. They hauled all that overburden off out to the desert and they buried it and brought in fresh overburden. in order to reduce the amount of exposure to the community. That was the mitigation measures that they used. But let me go, I'm going to go back. Hospital visits. That's what that was aimed at, was mitigating hospital visits. However, there was also a long-term issue with this EJ community, and that was economic opportunity. Well, that's not an EJ issue. That's an economic issue, and it's a long-term issue. That's not tied to this project. However, what the federal government did, because this was a federal project, one of the mitigation measures as an economic compensation was we gave low interest federal business loans to the local minority businesses within Watts community. Now, that has nothing to do with the railroad right-of-way project. That's a long-standing economic disadvantage problem. But we went ahead as a federal government and added that economic mitigation measure, even though it really was not a part of a direct effect from the project. So sometimes you'll find in EJ, as I indicated earlier, that you're going to solve your EJ component one way, but you may find you're going to deal with other social and economic issues as a parallel process. It's not really an environmental justice issue. You're going to be fine. You get faced with those all the time. The bottom line, your analysis has got to be done so that you can show that you've not been arbitrary or capricious in the way you've done the analysis, and that you have taken the hard look at the environmental consequences. So what are these? And these are federal, but you're going to find at the state level, you have very similar kinds of criteria. You have an umbrella, arbitrary capricious. That's under the Administrative Procedure Act. Under that, you have what we call the hard look standard. These are the technical, analytical standards. So under arbitrary and capricious, did you overlook evidence? Somebody walked in with data, studies, evidence that suggests something's going on and you blew it off. If you do that, you're not going to prevail. This is the guts. These two next ones are the guts to what you have to do in an EJ analysis. Unwarranted by the facts, lacks logic. Do the facts that you have discussed and the logic of how you use those facts, does it make sense where you get to? Unwarranted by the facts, lacks logic. The last one, clear error of judgment. Now, where this comes into play is where an agency has tried to solve a problem by imposing requirements for which they have no authority. That's what we call a clear error judgment. Recently, two Supreme Court cases have brought this to light. One is the West Virginia case, was decided last year by the Supreme Court, that basically told EPA, clear error judgment. You do not have the authority to control stationary coal-fired generating plants the way you think you do. You misinterpreted the law. That's called the clear error judgment. The other one was just decided this week by the Supreme Court, and that's what we call the Sackett case. For some of you who deal with the Corps of Engineers, you're probably aware of that. Has to do with the designation of wetlands and what qualifies as a designated wetland under the Clean Water Act as subject to 404 permits. And the Corps and EPA were also told that was a clear error of judgment. Interesting decision that came out of all those, but that's going a little far afield here. Anyway, that's arbitrary capricious. When you're doing the analysis, this technical EJ cause effect sequencing I talked about, that's where you deal with the hard look. Assumptions spelled out, methodologies disclosed, contradictory evidence addressed, records referenced solidly grounded in silence, guesswork eliminated, conclusion supported, manner capable of judicial understanding. Can a judge read it and understand it? That's what this last one. Let me comment though on guesswork eliminated. You all use professional judgment. Professional judgment, unsupported by logic and evidence, is guesswork. I don't care you've been a social scientist for the last 30 years and you believe that doing this project is going to have this impact on this EJ community. Where's the evidence? And what's the logic stream that get you to that conclusion? I don't care you got 32 years of professional judgment. That's not good enough. So this guesswork one is really an important one in EJ analysis. You have to have the logic stream, the cause effect sequencing that shows how you got to your endpoint. Interesting aspect for environmental justice. It's new. It really is relatively new. There was no federal agency issued formal guidance, meaning it had gone through some public evaluation, some public comment, until 2008. Even though we had the executive order going back all the way to 94, we really didn't get federal guidance until 2008, and that came from DOT. States didn't begin their EJ guidance until 2007. So it's relatively new in terms of environmental analysis. So the bottom line, we use what we can as EJ guidance at the federal and state level expands. Some of you have probably, I'm sure all of you are aware of the debate reduction bill recently passed the House. I'm assuming you're at least all, you may not be aware of what's in it. You may want to read it. 99 pages in its current draft form. Of the 99 pages, 20 pages of the Debt Reduction Act, 20% of that bill is devoted to environmental analysis, NEPA. But what I found interesting, I went through it, of the 20 pages that deals with environmental analysis and thresholds and when you do an EIS and when you do an EA and categorical exclusions and preparing environmental documents and page limits and oh God, it goes on and on and on. 20 pages of instructions of statute to agencies, not one reference to environmental justice. Where we're going to go then is exploring technical tools, EJ Screen, Cal Enviro Screen, the public's role, and we'll talk about some interesting case studies that are a little bit different than what you normally look at for EJ.